Clear. This isn't just speculation. The case I'm building today is grounded in established scholarly work and primary sources. We're talking about ancient texts and artifacts that have been around for thousands of years. My research is just bringing these scattered data points together to make a connection that academic silos often miss. If this identification is correct, and I'm going to show you why I think that it is, this isn't just another cool archaeological find. This would be the only contemporary image of a biblical patriarch anywhere in the world. We aren't talking about a painting from centuries later. It's not an artist's imagination. It's not a Renaissance painting or a medieval drawing. We're talking about an Egyptian painter working around 1900 BC, documenting a real person who walked into Egypt, a man he actually saw. We could be looking at Abraham's real face, his clothes, his family traveling with him, and the weapons his men carried. Think about what that actually means. Every image of Abraham you've ever seen, Sunday school materials, Bible illustrations, children's books, all of that gets replaced by this 4,000-year-old Egyptian painting. Scholars who dismiss the patriarchs as legend or as theological fiction with no history behind it would have to reckon with contemporary Egyptian documentation. The Egyptian account of Abraham in Egypt, which is often treated as folklore, would have external, non-biblical verification. It would literally shift everything we know about Genesis. Dating the patriarchs, understanding their world, the entire scholarly conversation would have to be reframed. So why isn't this common knowledge? Why isn't this painting in every Bible dictionary and seminary textbook? Why aren't pastors preaching on it? Because most scholars have dismissed it as a coincidence. They see it as just another trader with a similar sounding name. Nothing to do with the Bible. It's time to just move along. But when you actually look at the evidence, when you dig into the linguistics, the chronology, the cultural markers, coincidence becomes really hard to defend. The pieces fit together too well. Today we're going to build the case, piece by piece. By the end of this video, you'll see why I believe that Abisha, the Amu, and Abraham, the patriarch, are the same person. And if I'm right, you'll never read Genesis 12 the same way again. Let's start with what we know for sure, the facts that no one disputes. In the late 1800s, archaeologists excavated some rock cutout tombs at a site called Beni Hassan in Middle Egypt. Now, these aren't the Great Pyramids or the Valley of the Kings. These belong to provincial governors, basically regional managers, who ruled districts of Egypt during the Middle Kingdom period. One tomb stood out. It belonged to a guy named Khnumhotep II. He was governor of the Oryx district around 1900 BC. His tomb is massive, and it's covered in the usual scenes like farming, hunting, offerings to gods, and the standard stuff. But on one wall, right in the middle of all of these typical Egyptian scenes, there's something completely different. It's a procession of foreigners entering Egypt. There are 37 people, and they stick out immediately because everything about them is different. They're wearing elaborate, colorful clothes, nothing like the Egyptians' dress. The men have full beards, which Egyptians didn't do. They're carrying bows and weapons, but they aren't prisoners. They aren't tied up. They're peaceful visitors bringing trade goods. Now, obviously, the painting has faded a lot over 4,000 years. So I've used AI to help visualize what this scene looks like when it was fresh. So you can see the colorful robes and the beards exactly as the artists painted them. And as good as AI is, it's probably going to get some things wrong, but this is generally the idea. The style makes it clear. This is a real event. The details are specific. The artist is recording something he saw. Above the scene, hieroglyphs identify these people as Amu. That's the standard term for Asiatics or Semites from Canaan. That's what the Egyptians called them. It's not an insult, it's just descriptive. It's like saying foreigners from the East. And critically, they name the leader, Abisha, chief of the Amu. The inscription says they're bringing eye paint, called stibium, along with other goods. This is a trading caravan arriving in Egypt to do business. When this was first discovered, people immediately asked, Abisha sounds a lot like Abraham. The timing is roughly right. Could there be a connection? But scholars shut that down pretty fast. They said, look, people moved around a lot in the Middle Bronze Age. This is just documentation of normal trade. Abisha is a common name. It's most likely just a coincidence. And so, for over a century, it's been the standard line. The painting is just a general background context to what was going on in the region. It shows us what people like Abraham might have looked like, but it's not him. But here's my argument. Nobody has really looked at all of the evidence together. They look at one piece and they say, well, it's just a coincidence, instead of seeing how the pieces stack up. What if this painting, created by an artist who was there, is documenting the exact event described in Genesis chapter 12? What if we're not looking at someone that's like Abraham, but we're looking at Abraham himself? Because when you really dig into the details, the linguistics, the dates, the culture, the evidence gets pretty compelling. So, let me walk you through it. And warning, there's a lot of evidence here. Now we have to address the elephant in the room, the name. The critics have looked at the inscription for a century and said it says Abisha, not Abraham, so obviously the case is closed. But this is where we have to stop thinking in English and start thinking in languages of the ancient world. Because when you actually dig into the linguistics, Abisha isn't a strike against the theory. It's actually one of the strongest pieces of evidence that we have. So let's break it down. The meaning first. Look at the definitions. The name Abram, before it was changed to Abraham, is made of two parts. Ab means father, and Ram means exalted or high. So Abram, is exalted father. Now let's look at Abisha. In the ancient Semitic languages of that time, Ab still means father. And Isha, or Yesha, conveys that concept of distinction and exaltation. Abisha translates to exalted father, or my father is divine, or my father is the prince. Do you see it? The meaning is identical. But Scott, you might ask, why wouldn't he just use the Hebrew name? Because Hebrew didn't exist yet. We often forget this. Abraham didn't speak Hebrew. He was from Ur of the Chaldees. He was a Mesopotamian. His native tongue would have been Akkadian or some very early Amorite dialect. Hebrew is a Canaanite dialect that developed later, a lot later, incorporating elements of languages that came before it, specifically Akkadian. So, put yourself in Abraham's sandals. He arrives in Egypt, he speaks Akkadian, he introduces himself using his Akkadian name, which means exalted father, and the Egyptian scribe, listening to this foreign tongue, writes down phonetically what he hears. He hears the Akkadian sounds for exalted father, and so he writes Abisha. Centuries later, when Moses is writing the Torah, he records the name of the language of his people, Hebrew. He uses the Hebrew equivalent of exalted father, which is Abram. The sound is different because the languages are different, but the identity is the same. It's the difference between calling a king Charles in English and Carlos in Spanish. The sounds change, but the man remains the same. So the fact that the painting says Abisha is actually perfect. If it said Avram or Abraham in perfect Hebrew, I'd be suspicious because that language hadn't been invented yet. Abisha is actually what a wealthy Akkadian chieftain named Exalted Father would have been called in 1900 BC. Now, on to the next challenge, the timeline. Chronology is usually where these theories die. You can have the right name and the right look, but if the dates are off by 200 years, none of it matters. So, it kind of begs the question, do the dates work here? First, a quick reality check. Aligning ancient timelines is messy. We're comparing Hebrew genealogies to Egyptian king lists. They don't count time the same way. We aren't looking for a synchronization to the exact same day. We're really looking for the same general era. The tomb painting is dated to the reign of Pharaoh Senuseret II, so that puts it roughly around 1878 BC, give or take a couple of years. Now, when was Abraham in Egypt? Traditional timelines often work backward from the Exodus, but I think that there's a better way to calculate this, one that the Apostle Paul actually uses in the New Testament. In Galatians 3, Paul says the law at Sinai came 430 years after the promise was given to Abraham. So with that, we can do a little math. The standard date, and I'm going to take the early date here, for Exodus is roughly 1446 BC. And if you go back 430 years from the law, you land in 1876 BC. That's the year Abraham enters Canaan. Genesis says he entered the land, traveled for a bit, and then a famine hit. He went down to Egypt shortly after arriving. So, let's look at the numbers. Abraham arrives in Egypt approximately 1876 BC, and the Beni Hassan painting is painted approximately 1878 BC. We're talking about a difference of maybe 2 years. Historically speaking, that is a bullseye. Even if our calculations are off by a decade or two, which happens all the time in ancient chronology, we're squarely in the same generation. Abraham and Abisha are contemporaries. This isn't a mismatch where we have to twist the numbers to make them fit. This is a convergence. Both timelines, independent of each other, point to the same exact moment in history. So, we have the name, we have the date, but the evidence that really convinced me, it's what these people actually look like. So up next, we're going to look at the cultural markers. Before we analyze the picture, we have to talk about the journey, because I think we can often get this cartoon version of events in our heads where Abraham just strolls across a line in the sand and poof, he's in Egypt. But in the Middle Bronze Age, it didn't really work that way. To get from Canaan to the court of a local governor, this group had to traverse what was known as the Ways of Horus. This was a military highway. It was a narrow strip of land along the coast of the Mediterranean, flanked by the sea on one side and deadly desert on the other. And waiting for them at the entrance to the delta was one of the most formidable structures in the ancient world. It was called the Walls of the Ruler. This was a massive system of fortifications built by the founder of the 12th dynasty, Amenemhat I. Its sole purpose was to stop Asiatics, or people like Abraham from the Canaanite area, from infiltrating Egypt. There are ancient Egyptian texts, like the prophecy of Neferti, that describe why this wall was built. It says this, verbatim, "To forbid the Asiatics to walk down into Egypt, they beg for water in the customary manner of order to let their cattle drink." That's exactly the biblical context. Famine, thirst, a desperate need to move herds to the Nile. And so, picture this scene. Abraham, or Abisha, isn't just wandering into town. He's approaching a militarized border zone. He's leading a convoy of 37 people, plus animals, up to a fortress gate manned by Egyptian archers who look down on sand dwellers with suspicion. This is a high-stakes moment. If you don't have the right gifts, the right status, or the right diplomatic touch, you don't get in. You get turned back to the desert, or worse. This explains why we have this painting. You don't just walk into Egypt anonymous. You have to be processed. You have to be documented. And so the painting at Beni Hassan isn't just art. It's essentially like a passport stamp. It's an immigration record. The scribe notes specifically that they carried a safe conduct or a permit pass with them. It implies that Abisha, or Abraham, had the diplomatic clout to secure a visa before he even arrived. He wasn't a refugee sneaking under the fence. He was a dignitary with paperwork. And once they passed the wall, they didn't just stop at the first town. They traveled deep into the country, about 160 miles south, to Beni Hassan. This wasn't a quick trip. It was a tour. They were moving through the heart of the Egyptian state, likely protected by that safe conduct pass, until they reached the court of Khnumhotep. So when we look at the painting, we aren't just seeing a family portrait. We're seeing the survivors of a dangerous, bureaucratic, high-stakes diplomatic mission. This is where the evidence gets really cool for me personally. Because when you actually look at the painting, really zoom in on the details the artist recorded, these people don't look like generic Canaanites anymore. They look like they're from Mesopotamia. So let me show you what I mean. First, look at the clothes. These aren't just generic robes. They're decked out in elaborate and multicolored patterns. There are stripes and diamonds and complex geometric designs. The Egyptian artist spent a lot of time getting these details right. He's showing you the specific weave, the color combinations, the quality of the fabric. Now, compare that to what people in Canaan were actually wearing back then. We have the evidence, textiles, artwork, you name it. And generally speaking, Canaanite fashion was pretty simple. Maybe two-tone, but mostly practical, durable stuff. But the people in this painting, they look wealthy. They look sophisticated. They look like they come from a place with a serious textile industry. In other words, they look like they come from Mesopotamia. And we know this for a fact. We have thousands of receipts, literal clay tablets from the city of Ur that describe their massive textile industry. They were famous for it, in fact. The royal and wealthy classes in Ur wore exactly this kind of stuff: multicolored, geometric, high-end fabrics. And remember, this is exactly where Abraham was from. Genesis said he came from Ur of the Chaldees. He wasn't a native Canaanite. He grew up in the big city. He was raised in the heart of civilization. So even after he moved to Canaan, he wouldn't have just thrown out all of his wardrobe and started dressing like a local shepherd. He had the money and the status to keep dressing like a Mesopotamian. And that is exactly what we see on the wall at Bidya Hassan. Now, we've talked about the clothes, but there are still a few more details in this painting that almost everyone misses. And honestly, they might be the most important clues of all. Look closely at the second figure in the line. He's holding a musical instrument. It's called a lyre. To the casual observer, it's just a guy with a harp. But archaeologically, this is huge. The Egyptians didn't really play this type of portable lyre at this time in history. This was a Semitic instrument. In fact, this is one of the earliest known depictions of this instrument in the history of art. But why does it matter? Because it tells us about their culture. These aren't just survivalists trying not to starve. They are people of culture. They are people of song. Think about the Bible. Who is the father of music in Genesis? His name is Jubal. He's the descendant of Cain. Who is famous for playing the lyre and the kinnor? King David. Music was central to the worship and life of the Hebrew people. The fact that Abraham's group traveled with a designated musician tells us they valued art, history, and storytelling. They likely sang the songs of their ancestors around the campfires at night. They carried their culture with them. This is a distinctly Hebrew kind of culture. It suggests they weren't just bringing goods to trade, they were actually bringing entertainment. They were bringing their own history. In the ancient world, traveling chieftains were often expected to entertain their hosts. A wealthy patriarch from Ur would bring his own bard to play for the Egyptian governor. So this is a sign of sophistication. Now look further back in the procession. Look at the donkeys. On the backs of the animals, you see distinct objects. Many scholars identify these as bellows, the tools used for smelting metal. This connects us to another fascinating detail. The inscription says they brought mazdemet, eye paint, or stibium. But stibium isn't just makeup, it's a mineral. It requires mining, it requires processing. In Genesis, the clan of Cain is associated with Tubal-Cain, the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron. There's a deep biblical tradition that the ancestors of Hebrews were skilled metallurgists. Later in the Bible, we see the Kenites, who were related to Moses by marriage, were traveling smiths. If this group is carrying bellows and metalworking tools, it implies they weren't just shepherds. They were craftsmen. They had technology that the Egyptians wanted. The Egyptians were great builders, but the Semitic peoples of the East were often the innovators in portable metallurgy and weaponry. So Abisha brings textiles, you see the coats, weaponry, there are bows and axes in the picture, music in that little harp called the lyre, the technology of the bellows and the smithing tools, and then of course the minerals in the stibium and eye paint. Do you see a picture forming here? This is a mobile industrial complex. Abraham represents a transfer of technology and culture from the height of Mesopotamian civilization into Egypt. He's bringing the wisdom of the Chaldeans into the land of the pharaohs. This fits perfectly with later Jewish traditions like Josephus, which claim that Abraham taught the Egyptians astronomy and mathematics. While the painting doesn't show him teaching math, it does show him bringing the tools of high culture. He is an ambassador of the advanced world. But it's not just the clothes and items they brought with them. Look at the men's faces. They have full, carefully groomed beards. They aren't wild or messy, they're styled. The hair is cut to a specific length. Again, this is a dead ringer for Sumerian grooming styles. It doesn't match the Canaanites, and it definitely doesn't match the Egyptians, who were usually clean-shaven. It matches the statutes and the art we find in Mesopotamia. Abraham is a guy from Ur of Chaldees, living in a foreign land, keeping his cultural identity intact. Let's go back one more step and look at the gear. The men are carrying throw sticks and composite bows. The way they carry them, the specific design of the weapons, archaeologists have pointed out that these have Eastern origins. This isn't the kit you'd expect from a local Canaanite militia. This is gear from the East. Everything about them, the clothes, the hair, the weapons, it all screams Mesopotamia. Finally, look at who is in the group. It's not a raiding party. You don't bring women and children to a war. It's not just a standard merchant caravan, which would usually be just men. It's a family. It's a clan. You see men and women and children all traveling together. This matches the biblical description of Abraham perfectly. Genesis says he took his wife, his nephew, and all the substance they had gathered, and he didn't leave the family behind. He moved as a unit, a mobile community. Now, the painting shows 37 people. Is that Abraham's whole camp? Probably not. We know he had hundreds of people in his household, but 37 is the perfect size for a delegation. You don't march 2,000 people into an Egyptian governor's office to buy grain. You take a representative group, the head of the clan, the key family members, some guards, and the trade goods. Now, I know what you might be thinking. You might be asking, Scott, wouldn't Abraham have just blended in after living in Canaan for a few years? Honestly, I don't think so. First, his household was huge, potentially thousands of people. I mean, you had hundreds of armed men that were born in his household. When you have a group that big, you don't have to assimilate. You are your own culture. You keep your own language. You keep your own customs, and yes, your own fashion. And second, he was rich. Wealth gives you the option to be different. He wasn't begging for scraps. He was an independent power in the region. So when he walked into Egypt, he would have looked exactly like what he was, a wealthy, high-status Mesopotamian clan leader. And that is exactly what the Beni Hassan painting shows us. Now, before we get to the final verdict, we have to talk about the man who commissioned this painting. Because once you understand who Khnum-Hotep was, you realize why this painting is such a big deal. This is political propaganda. We're in the 12th dynasty of Egypt. This is the Middle Kingdom, specifically the reign of Pharaoh Senuseret II. This was a time when the central government was trying to consolidate power, but strong provincial governors, called nomarchs, still held massive influence. Khnum-Hotep II was the nomarch of the Oryx nome. He wasn't just a bureaucrat, he was a power player. He came from a long line of governors who acted almost like local kings. His tomb at Beni Hassan is one of the most elaborate ever found for a private citizen. But why does this matter? Because guys like Khnum-Hotep didn't paint random things on their walls. In Egyptian tomb art, every square inch is calculated. It's a resume for the afterlife. You list your titles, your vast herds of cattle, and your diplomatic triumphs to show the gods, and of course history, that you are a man of order and wealth and status. So why include a group of foreigners in such an important space? Khnum-Hotep is boasting. He's showing that his influence extends beyond the borders of Egypt. He's saying, look at me, I am so powerful and my territory is so stable that wealthy chieftains from foreign lands come specifically to trade with me. He calls them Amu, which is the generic name for Asiatics or Canaanites, but he treats them with dignity. He records their specific gear, their distinct musical instruments, and their high-status textiles. If this was just a group of starving refugees begging for bread, they wouldn't be on the wall of a powerful nomarch. You don't put beggars on your resume, you put peers, you put dignitaries. This tells us that the leader of this group, this man named Abisha, was viewed by the Egyptian governor as a man of significance, a man worth recording. Okay, so we've looked at the name, the timeline, and the cultural markers. Now let's actually open the Bible and see how the Genesis account matches what is on that wall. Because if this really is Abraham, the details in the text should line up with the details in the painting. And when you look closely, they do. Genesis 12, verse 10 gives us the setup. It says this, "And there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down into Egypt to sojourn there." This is the key context. Abraham isn't invading. He isn't migrating permanently. He is sojourning, looking for temporary refuge because the food ran out in Canaan. Now look at the painting. The inscription identifies people as Amu, foreigners from the east. And it specifically notes they are bringing trade goods, and in this case, it's eye paint. You don't show up to a foreign country during a famine empty-handed. You bring something to trade. Abraham was wealthy, so he brought high-value, portable goods to negotiate for grain. Eye paint, or stibium, was perfect for this. Valuable, easy to carry, and in demand in Egypt. Then we have the famous and kind of awkward incident where Abraham says Sarah is his sister. Pharaoh takes her into his house, and in Genesis 12, verse 16, he says this, "And he entreated Abraham well for her sake, and he had sheep and oxen and he-asses and men servants and maidservants, etc." Basically, there is a massive transfer of wealth here. This is ancient diplomacy. You don't just take someone's sister, you pay for the alliance. Later, when Pharaoh realizes the truth, he sends Abraham away, and in Genesis 13, verse 2, he tells us, "And Abraham was very rich in cattle and silver and in gold." Now compare that to the figure of Abisha in the painting. Does he look like a starving refugee? No. He looks like a wealthy clan leader. He's dressed in those expensive Mesopotamian textiles. He's leading a delegation. He's meeting with a governor. And here's where the pieces fit together. Abraham enters as a wealthy outsider seeking refuge. Abisha is depicted as a chief of Amu entering Egypt. Abraham travels with his whole household, his wife, nephew, servants. The painting shows a mixed group of 37 men, women, and children, a family unit. Genesis describes a high-level diplomatic exchange involving wealth, and the painting commemorates a formal visit involving trade goods. You might ask, but the Bible says Abraham met with Pharaoh. This tomb belongs to a provincial governor named Khnumhotep, so why would he care about Abraham? Here's the geography. Khnumhotep's district was in Middle Egypt. If you're traveling from Canaan to the royal court, or if you're moving around Egypt seeking pasture and grain, you pass through these regions. Khnumhotep would have been one of the officials Abraham had to deal with, maybe the one who processed his entry, accepted his initial trade goods, or even facilitated his move toward the capital. The fact that Khnumhotep chose to paint this on his wall tells us something huge. This visit mattered. Egyptian governors didn't paint random beggars on their tomb walls. They painted their achievements. They painted important events. The arrival of this wealthy, exotic Mesopotamian chieftain was significant enough that Khnumhotep wanted to be remembered for it 4,000 years later. So we have a wealthy leader arriving in Egypt during a famine with his family, bringing trade goods, meeting with officials, and leaving an impression that lasted for centuries. That sounds exactly like Abraham. But of course, people still have objections. What about the dates? Or what about the name? The objections are understandable. So in the final part, I'm going to tackle the biggest objections head on and give you the final verdict. The first objection, it's just a generic scene. Well, if this was just a generic stock image of foreigners, why name the leader? Why be specific of the exact number of guests, being 37 people? Why record the exact date, the year 6 of Senusret II? Generic art is vague. This is specific. This is a record of a real event that happened in an actual place on a specific day. Khnumhotep wanted this specific visit remembered. Okay, so objection number 2 might be that the name isn't Abraham, it's Abisha. Critics say Abisha, not Abraham, not the same name, not the same person. But that's actually the smoking gun. Both names mean the same exact thing, exalted father. Remember, Abraham didn't speak Hebrew. It didn't exist yet. He spoke Akkadian. And in his native Akkadian, exalted father is Abisha. The Bible simply uses the later Hebrew translation, Abram. So the wall isn't wrong, it's just preserving his actual original name. It isn't a contradiction, it's actually a perfect linguistic match. Objection 3, the dates don't match. Well, chronology is actually a really hard thing in ancient history. Depending on which scholar you ask, Abraham lived anywhere from 2100 BC to 1500 BC. But the 19th century, around 1890 BC, the exact time of this painting, is widely considered by many biblical archaeologists to be the Middle Bronze Age sweet spot for the patriarchal period. It fits the culture and the geopolitics and the migration patterns perfectly. So, what do we do with all of this? If we accept that this painting gives us a glimpse of a historical Abraham, it demands that we completely rewrite the picture we have in our heads. Growing up in Sunday school, I always pictured Abraham as this quiet, humble nomad. A guy in a dusty robe, wandering alone through the desert and maybe looking a little lost. But the Beni Hassan painting doesn't show us a drifter at all. It shows us a prince or a king, a chieftain. It shows us a man dressed in the finest royal textiles of the ancient world. It shows us a man commanding a retinue of warriors armed with advanced composite bows and axes. It shows us a diplomat who walks into the courts of world powers and is treated with respect. And suddenly, the rest of the Bible starts to make sense. Think about Genesis 14. Do you remember that story? Lot gets captured by a coalition of 4 powerful kings. If Abraham was just a lonely shepherd, the story is impossible. But the Bible says Abraham mustered 318 trained soldiers, men who were born in his own household, and chased down 4 armies. That's not the act of a shepherd. That's the act of a warlord. That's the man we see on the wall in Beni Hassan. The man with the weapons, the man with the exalted father name. This painting explains how Abraham could talk face-to-face with pharaohs. It explains how he could negotiate treaties with Abimelech. It explains why the Hittites in Genesis 23 called him a mighty prince among us. Because he was. We've spent so much time trying to make Abraham relatable that we forgot that he was formidable. God didn't just pick a random guy in the desert. He picked a leader. He picked a man who could command respect in the palaces of Egypt and on the battlefields of Canaan. And if you ask me, that makes his faith even more impressive. Abraham had wealth. He had power. He had the coat of many colors before Joseph was even born. He had everything the world could offer a man in 1900 BC, and yet, when God called him, he was willing to put it all on the line. He was willing to be a stranger in a strange land, trusting a promise he couldn't see. So, the next time you read Genesis, don't picture a peasant. Picture the man on the wall. Picture the prince, Abisha the Amu, and remember that that is the kind of strength it takes to walk with God. Thanks for joining me on this episode. And if you want to dive deeper into biblical history, or the weird stories in scripture that everyone skips, or surprising new takes on old ideas like this one, hit that subscribe button and I'll see you in the next one.